So today I'm going to be taking a look at a watch that I've owned for years, but somehow I've never really reviewed it. It's been one of my favorite pieces in my collection, and I just do think it's a pretty interesting watch overall. So let's take a closer look. So we have a diameter of about 39.8, lug to lug of 46.5, height of 13.4, and a lug width of 20 millimeters. Some other general specifications for this watch: we're going to have the Seiko in-house 6R24 movement beating away in here. It does have a little bit of complication to it. We obviously have a power reserve indicator, day of the week, and a day of the month, which is pretty cool. It's not something you see very often, especially in watches of this price range, so nice touch. We do have a sapphire crystal here, which is always nice to see on a Seiko of a more affordable price range, but they do go for a hard-lex crystal on the back. I can't complain too much. I mean, it's very rare you're going to do anything that will crack the back of the crystal, and at least they did go for an open case back. We do have 100 meters of stated water resistance, but this is just a push-pull crown, so you're going to be relying a lot on those gaskets, and stick to your service intervals if you actually want it to be waterproof. But this is a little bit of a dressier piece, so probably not going to be taking it near water. And of course, kind of one of the main stars of the show here is we have this enamel dial done, which I think is a really beautiful execution. Finally, the price, and it's a little hard to gauge because I believe this model is discontinued, or at least it was always a JDM model, and it's kind of hard to see pricing, or it's hard to find them new. So in terms of finding them just in the market used/new, it's usually between $1,000 to $1,500. So starting off with the dial here, and I think this is undoubtedly the best part about this watch, and it feels a lot higher end than you would expect to for the price. Even if you take the higher end 15, let's say $1,600, you're getting a beautiful, almost pure white enamel dial. It has this beautiful glossy type sheen to it. You can see for the power reserve indicators, or at least really every indicator on the dial, there's this little cut down, little dip down into the surface, so you have a little bit of depth built in. And of course you have this very monochromatic but really pleasing high contrast color scheme with the pure white of the enamel, and then the printing all done in black, and the hands as well done in black, which I think is a really nice touch. I really love the handset of this watch too. I don't know if it has an actual name for this type of styling. I forget off the top of my head. It may be Spade or something similar to that. If it has something like that, I'll correct down below near here. But it just has this really beautiful shape to it. Kind of almost a leaf style minute hand, and this more unique ornamental hour hand. It blends along perfectly with the classiness of the watch. Maybe you can say legibility is hindered because they are fairly thin, but because it's on a white background, I do think they pop nicely against the dial, and it is just really elegant looking, really classy, and a little bit more dressy than I think Seiko at this price point usually goes. I mean, they're more known for sports watches, and even in the typical Presage and, like, let's say Cocktail Time series range, there's a little bit more pizzazz and a little bit more modern flair to it, whereas this is more almost old world craft, traditional watchmaking type look. Something I really like is, one, I feel like the numerals are very well sized. They're large and they're printed pretty boldly, but they don't feel too large, they don't feel comical. They have a nice subtle cursive script to them, and it just is, to me, very pleasing to the eye. I like these subtle little bend in for, like, let's say the 2 here on the 12. It's just that little hint of flair, that little touch of just something different, whereas you go to the 1 and it's a very solid blocky numeral. So it's just these little aspects that I think really elevate the watch, and these thinner and thicker elements blend well with the rest of the dial because we have very thin hands for all the subdials. We have thin hands for the actual handset, or the main handset. We have thin text on the dial. So there's a lot to love here. There's a lot of cohesiveness, and I can't say anything else other than Seiko did a really good job. One thing I am not a huge fan of is I do think the text is a little odd. Of course, we have Seiko here at 12, and I'm fine with that. It looks great, fairly thick, or at least printed to a proportion that I think looks good on the watch. But then we have automatic and 31 joules written right below it, and it's a little bit of a smaller text, and it's just odd to me. I do think they could have just put Seiko on it and it would have looked fine. Of course, they just kind of have to put things on the dial and let the world know what else is going on. And it's not egregious, but I do think it would have been a lot better without it. And to me, it doesn't really add anything to the watch or to the dial or to the elegance. What I will commend Seiko on is how much information is on this dial, but how clean it still feels. You have all these half circles, these crescents of information, and it just feels both cluttered but clean at the same time, which is an interesting thing. You have the days of the month written out, but they only progress by odd numbers, so it's not too overly cluttered, but you still get a lot of kind of life and text in that little section there. The weeks are all named out there. The powers are decently proportioned. And what I also really like about the functionality of this watch is the day of the week and the day of the month are both retrograde counters. So if I move the crown, if I put it to the first position, if I move towards myself, I'm moving the date here. So boom, the date's jumping along, and it's a really smooth action. It doesn't feel clunky, it doesn't feel cheap, it doesn't feel undeserving of the price point it's at. It is a very smooth and almost premium feeling movement. And then we get towards the end here. Boom, and it snaps back. It snaps back perfectly, it snaps back fast, it doesn't feel jittery, it doesn't feel too mechanically clunky or anything like that. It is a beautiful action and it's executed well. By comparison, if I cycle up, I'm going through the day of the week, of course, and then if I get to Saturday, boom, it snaps back. Again, very fluid feeling, really cool just to see in motion. And it's always nice too, because typically your little reserve indicators are going to be at different positions. So you have this kind of a life and this play on the dial that you wouldn't get with something that has registers like this, or you wouldn't get from something that just has a date window. There's just a lot more character to this layout of the watch, and it's not something we see. I haven't seen this kind of layout before outside of Seiko for the most part. I'm sure some higher end brands do it, but again, at this price point, it's a very unique way of telling the time and telling you information outside of the time. Talking really quickly on the winding, it is just a Seiko movement. It has that kind of little screechy feel. It's not super gritty or anything like that, and the crown is well sized in this kind of buttercup formation, so it's easy to grip, easy to wind. Of course, if I move the hand a little bit, it's pretty easy to tell what the power reserve is. We have a little over 40 hours, maybe give or take 44, 45. So it's really nice just to be able to visually see that, and again, get that living gauge, that living piece of the watch dial throughout the day. So taking a look in natural light, we can see it just presents beautifully outside. It becomes a nice bright white, as you know, I mean, it really always is, but you can see the sub counters just kind of popping out a little bit, that little sunken recess. The numerals themselves are popping, and it just is a beautiful dial. It doesn't have much color change to it, even at off angles or anything really. It doesn't even glare that much, which is also really nice. So it's very visible and just nice in person and nice at even extreme angles. Looking more in direct sunlight, thankfully the white still stays this pure nice white. It doesn't really change. It doesn't get any grosser, I guess you could say. The color stays consistent, and again, it just is very legible. There's no reflections really at all. It really just is a watch that presents well. So taking a look at the dial under magnification, and it is interesting because you get this almost like speckled Oreo pattern. And it's not something you ever really notice from wrist view, at least to me and to my eye, and before ever taking this under a loupe, I've always assumed the dial was a pure and clean white, so these kind of little specks don't really shine through. I don't know if it's a defect, I don't know if it's supposed to be there, I don't know if it's a byproduct of this enameling process, but as it stands, I don't mind it, and I think it is a cool little hidden detail when you zoom in. Looking at all the text on the dial, it does have a little bit of life to it. You can see there is a little bit of inkiness. I would personally like to see, especially the numerals, be printed just a tad thicker to give this watch a little bit more life. I don't mind how it's done. You can kind of see it has this beautiful grain and especially beautiful thick border around the numeral, and I kind of just wish the whole numeral was that way. But again, executed well. These kind of sharp and really thin edges are still pretty crisp and clean. As I focus on the one here, you can kind of see how the ink or glaze or whatever process they use, I'm sure it's kind of more of a pad printing that kind of dried in an odd way. But again, this is not a thing you see from wrist. And it doesn't really give any feel of it being unpolished or badly QC'd. It's just part of the watch. Looking at the handset, of course, we have this beautiful black, piano black type look to them. There are some imperfections, like you can see there, that kind of dust or white dots there towards the middle of the minute hand. I do like how thin it gets and how consistent the color is. There isn't any blotchiness or anything like that. You even have this gentle dip down into the middle of the hour hand. So you have this just hidden amount of depth, hidden amount of detail that almost no one in their right mind would pay attention to or notice. But the hands themselves have this beautiful shape. Even the hour hand here is rounded, not flat. So this just adds a little bit of dimension to the watch that again, although the naked eye might not notice immediately, it comes together to just make a beautiful package altogether. Similar story for the sub-register hands. They're done in the same beautiful lacquer, nice rounded shape to them as well. Of course, you have this little dip down into the surface of the dial and this little kind of seashell shape, but it is this very interesting and detailed tiny little portions of the dial, which I like. Again, the printing is still relatively thick, thicker than I would have expected for numerals this small. So at least to me, it's nice to see that Seiko had consistency with this design, with this watch. They didn't cut corners, they didn't do things kind of in a shoddy way just because it's smaller and no one would ever see it. It's all executed to a very high standard, and I appreciate that. One of my main gripes with the watch is this little cut-off 6 here. To me, it doesn't look perfect, it's not great. But it is what it is. I don't notice it overly often, and it is kind of cool. This little hand here kind of grows out of the 6 in a sense. Then you can see there a little bit of an imperfection around the 6 embedded into the enamel dial. With the process like this, especially at the price point, it's kind of to be expected, and I'm surprised that I didn't see it more widespread throughout the dial of the watch. So overall, I think this is a beautifully done dial. There's a lot of hidden detail. There's a lot of just beautiful attention to detail, and I do think that Seiko deserves credit. They did a really good job. So moving on to the case of this watch, and I don't think it's necessarily as interesting as the dial, but it's still well executed. We have this very circular, really round case. It has this kind of bell-like shape to it. It's the thinnest here at the bezel. It kind of widens out towards the middle of the case, and then again thins out again towards the case back. So beautiful symmetry. It wears smaller than you expect it to. Again, we're looking at almost about 40 millimeters at its thickest part, but we're actually closer to 38.5 just bezel to bezel at its thinnest. So it has a really unique kind of wearing experience on wrist, and it does wear well for its size. It's also nice that they kept the lugs fairly short. Because of that, it does wear well. It would wear well on small wrists. It has a little bit of turn down, but not a lot of curvature in the way the case back is because it's a little bit thicker. The case back, depending on how you wear your watch, typically will sit into the wrist a little bit, so at least some of that thickness is hidden. It's not a thin watch by any means, but we do have a relatively complicated movement in it. We have retrograde sub-dials, right? So it's one of those things where it's a give and take. At this price point, it's probably really the best they can do, and it's not terrible for what you're getting, and it does wear fairly well. Looking kind of a little bit more generally at the finishing, we do just have high polish everywhere. There aren't any brushed accents. It is a very polished, dressy looking watch. It doesn't have a lot of kind of metal shooting you in the face in a sense, or shining you in the face, I guess you could say. There's a lot of really thinner elements of metal kind of top down. The bezel's fairly thin and kind of sloped outwards, so you don't see it as much. The lugs themselves are relatively thin and thin out towards the edges. They have this kind of beautiful cut here as well. They're kind of almost in a sense soldered into the case, and then cut a tiny bit here to just give a little bit of shape, give a little bit of definition away from the case itself. Beautiful shape to them. They have a small little chamfer on the side, but again, just still all high polish. It's one of those things where honestly, I feel like they didn't do a bunch of finishing to the case because the dial is supposed to be taking the front show. If there was beautiful transitions between brush and polish, one, I don't think it would look great on this watch because it's meant to be dressier. It's not meant to give any air of sportiness. But two, that beautiful finishing, while maybe done well and executed nicely and maybe adding to a great overall appearance of the case, would, in my opinion, probably detract from the dial. And the dial is so well done here and clearly the star of the show that I think this is what you're supposed to do for the case. Again, crown well proportioned, operates well. We'd sign little Seiko S there. And then looking at the case back, it's really nothing to write home about. Of course, we get this little bit of striping on the rotor. That's a nice little touch, some gold Seiko lettering, but it's a relatively brutalist, unfinished movement, kind of similar to almost every Seiko you see in the sub $1,000 price range. And I'm not too mad about it. You know, it is what it is. I do think you're getting a lot more on the front of the watch. You're getting a lot more in terms of the movement, and I'm okay that it's unfinished. It would be cool if they did some more to it, but, you know, why not? And of course, just some general text on the outside. Again, water resistance, 100 meters. Pretty crazy that they went for that standard with this type of watch, but hey, you know, overachiever, I guess. So moving on to how this watch wears, earlier I was wearing this beautiful vintage Seiko Lord Marvel, kind of just fitting in that Seiko theme today. And here we have the watch sitting on my 6.5-inch wrist, and I think you can tell it fits pretty perfectly. Again, it's relatively short lug to lug, so it does just sit itself and plant itself well on the wrist. It doesn't rise up like crazy. It doesn't feel like you're wearing a fishbowl or anything, so it does have a fairly good presence on wrist. Because of that kind of bowl, kind of bell shape to it, it can feel a little bit odd at times because it almost, in a sense, makes it feel higher up than it actually is because you see some of the case in a sense. It's a give and take. I don't hate it. One thing I will note is the dial at times does seem a little far down into the case. So I think that also helps or kind of hurts it in its perceived thickness because the dial's not as close to the crystal as maybe potentially you could get it to be. Super minor nitpick, and I do like how it displays, so again, not a big deal. I just really love how on wrist, you can tell this does have just a consistency of design language. There's a lot of these thin, gentle elements on the case which fit well with the thinner elements on the dial, the hands, the text, the kind of gentle little swoops in some of these numerals. It feels at harmony within itself. They didn't go with a super blocky, sporty case on a dressy watch. They didn't go for a dressy case style with a sporty dial. It just feels right. It feels like they executed it well. Looking at it from the side view, again, it's not the thinnest thing on planet Earth. It's a little bit of a slab at times, but it doesn't wear too bad. It doesn't ever feel like I'm wearing some humongous thing. It just feels like a watch. It does feel a little bit thick at times. Although we're talking something a little bit over 13 millimeters in thickness, it doesn't feel crazy or monstrous. It just wears well relatively. Of course, if you're just sitting there like this, you'll kind of notice it. But other than that, when you're just staring at it dead on, it just looks like a pretty watch. And moving the watch up a little bit, I have closer to a 6-inch wrist there, and you can still see I have room on each side of the wrist. I think it still looks fairly proportional. So this watch, despite being 40, despite being a white dial that typically feels expansive, it can wear on pretty small wrists and still look great. And then before moving on to the other straps, just to note, this is not the original strap. I think it came on some classic, terrible Seiko black alligator type situation with the deployant. Terrible strap in my opinion. Works on the watch in terms of a dressy, nice monochrome look, but because it's a beautiful white dial, it has this nice blank canvas, both appearance and idea about it. You can put just about any color on it and it works. This is a nice Buttero leather, natural leather grain, and it ages to this beautiful tan, almost cognac brown. And I think it dresses down the watch a little bit. It doesn't make it too serious. The white stitching ties into the dressiness and just color of the dial. And it's comfortable. It doesn't feel too dressy. It doesn't feel too sporty. Of course, it's a little dressier by nature, but to me, it just looks good, feels good, and works. As a kind of funky, cool strap option, there's this Theo and Harris collaborated with John Rousseau cork strap. I think it pairs awesomely. This kind of little black intermittent tone of the cork works well with the blackness of the dial elements, and that kind of tannish, neutral, barkish, corkish color just works on the dial in my opinion. One thing I love about this watch is how kind of glossy white, pure white that dial is. It's one of those things where I think white's a hard color to do, especially if you're using metal applied elements, or if you're using lume on any metal applied elements, or just lume at all. It kind of detracts from the whiteness of the dial of the watch. It distracts your eye. You either get the silver sheen of this silver or stainless steel applied markers, you either get the not quite color matched whiteness of a lume, or even worse, if you get some kind of Superluminova C3 or something, you're getting a green, in my opinion, ugly tone introduced on a white dial. So there's a lot of things that can, in my opinion, go wrong. But by contrast, this printed styling, this black on white monotone look just works perfectly. It does only things to complement and really bring out that crisp whiteness and just look great in my opinion. As a somewhat kind of in-between dressy, sporty type of look, we can go with something like this very deep, beautiful green tone. It's rich, but it doesn't have a texture. It's not an alligator, it's not a exotic grain, it's just regular, I believe, calf skin or something. This strap is from Veblenist. I'll have it linked down below. Super supple, super clean. And again, because it's a white dial, you can put pretty much any color on it and it works and it looks cool. It looks great. That plain grain really just complements the dial nicely, adding a pop of color but not being too drastic, not too dramatic, and just having a really rich and classic feel about it overall. As a really almost deceivingly awesome combo in my opinion, we have this crown and buckle chevron strap in this Harris tweed configuration. That gray tone works perfectly on the watch. It adds a little bit of a grain texture that's not there on the watch naturally, and just looks good. Surprisingly, while being a not overly thin NATO or one-piece strap, on a thick watch relatively, to me it still wears well. To me it doesn't wear too badly. And I guess maybe that's just a testament to how comfortable and good these straps can be. And there we have it on wrist, and honestly maybe the look won't be for everybody, but I really dig it. It gives this a little bit more of a casual feel, almost like if you're putting it on sweatpants or something like that. And it just, I think, works really well. That color neutral gray on the beautiful white. And again, even though it's on a one-piece strap, it really doesn't wear any more thickly than it did before. So I really dig this combo. And while I would love to put this watch on my classic white archer silicone, to me it doesn't really work. You're kind of clashing the white tones. It can kind of be a little bit odd, and maybe just a little bit too much, honestly. So let's go in the opposite direction of way too much and do this bright kind of bubblegum pink strap, which I also love. This is made by H&S Straps off of Amazon. They kind of don't make straps anymore, but you can kind of still order this pink one if you go to like select more buy options and just order one. To me, it looks great. I think this strap combo is really just a testament to how surprisingly versatile this watch is. You can put it on any color and it looks great. You can dress it down, and in my opinion, it looks great. Although it's oddly dressy, although it's this pure stark white dial, for some reason, and in my opinion, maybe you think I'm wrong, it really takes well to most straps, and it can be worn more casually. It can be worn dressed up if you put it on a more exotic leather grain. But to me, I like wearing it like this. It has a little bit of a contrast, a little bit of like this oxymoronic type feel, and I just really dig it. So starting off with the pros of this watch, and for me it's just the dial quality is fantastic. It's a very nice pure white dial. The printing on it is done crisply, cleanly in this beautiful black tone. It is just really, I think, arguably good looking dial. It is almost just nothing else I can say about it, right? It just is really a good job that Seiko did on it. It's pretty balanced, it looks pleasing, and they did a lot to declutter a very cluttered, information heavy dial. Another pro for me is I think just the size of it. It's nice to see that it's just a hair under 40 millimeters. It wears well on wrist. It doesn't have too long of lugs. So they did a lot to make this watch just wearable and look good, and they didn't go overboard with it in any way. And last but not least, I think this watch is just incredible value. You're getting an enamel dial, you're getting beautiful printing, you're getting a retrograde movement. These are all things that you really don't hear of at this around $1,000 price point. It's things that you typically think of in the tens of thousands of dollars. So it's amazing value that Seiko's really bringing at this price point. Sure, there's some things about it that aren't perfect, but you're gonna have concessions, right? And I do think that the pros heavily outweigh the cons here. So speaking on the cons that at least I have with the watch, and one is the fact that it is just a little bit thick. There's no two ways about it. It's a thick watch. They don't do anything to really hide the thickness. It's a fairly blocky mid case. So it's just one of those things where it's a retrograde movement. It has complication to it. I don't know how much thinner they could make the movement, or what they can do to even make it thinner. But likely if it became thinner, if they went in and redesigned or did something to it, it'd probably be more expensive. Would I pay, let's say, twice the price if it was still a little bit thinner? Probably. But I do think, again, the value that it's holding at what it is now is fantastic, and it's not overbearing on the wrist. Another slight con I have is I feel like the case itself can be just a little bit boring, a little bit underwhelming. It's very thin, it's very out of the way, and of course maybe we're just focusing on the dial more than anything here, and I completely understand. It's a fantastic dial, but I do think they could do something more intricate, more interesting with the case. I don't know what they would do, just maybe something more geometric with it, or something more streamlined in a sense of trying to make the case feel less blocky. I don't know, maybe add some more unique lug style. There's just a couple things I think they could do. It's a decent case as it is, and it's very serviceable, and maybe that's where they're cutting corners and saving some money, because maybe the dial is fairly expensive to do, but it's nothing to write home about. And really, I don't have much else to say bad about it. I guess you can say the original strap it comes with is kind of terrible. It's that classic Seiko leatherish crocodile feeling weirdness with the crappy deployant. Sure, it's serviceable, it's okay. I never wore it on that strap, and I don't even know where that strap is, so that's why I didn't show the strap. It's one of those things where you can get a $20 strap off of Amazon, and it's gonna be better than pretty much what it comes with. And it looks fantastic on the watch, so we're okay. It's not a big deal. I think in essence, final thoughts on this is I just do really love it. I do think the pros, again, heavily outweigh the cons. It's a watch that I remember ordering, let's say this was maybe 3-4 years ago, and I ordered it and I thought, you know, it might be cool, it might be interesting, but when I got it in person, I was almost stunned. It was much better than I expected. The watch comes together very nicely. The subtle depth of the dip down to the sub-registers, the beautiful pure white of the dial, just the overall design is also just, again, something you don't see anywhere at this price. So it's offering so much uniqueness, so much class, so much just different, that it's hard, at least for someone like me who prefers dress watches, to not like this watch. I know Seiko still has this kind of like masterpiece-ish kind of range. I forget if that's the exact terminology they use, but it's still under the Presage moniker. They still do some porcelain dials, enamel dials, all that good stuff. There's nothing quite in the current catalog like this that uses regular Arabic numerals. Most of them use Romans and things like that. I don't like those as much. They feel like they're trying a little bit too hard in a sense. And I'm sure those also look good in person, but I really like this more playful use, more, yeah, I guess less serious use of a retrograde configuration, because with the Romans, I just feel like it makes it a little bit too dressy. So as this watch stands, I think it's amazing value. Again, you can pick them up used for around $1,000 or so, and there isn't really much out there that competes with this watch or does what this watch does, or I think even looks as good as this watch. For a long time, this was the watch that I used as kind of a benchmark of saying, hey, is this watch I'm buying really worth it? Is it as good as this watch or better if I'm paying more than I paid for this watch? And that's, I think, some pretty heavy praise to put onto something. This is a benchmark for the price point and for watches more expensive than that price point. I do think if Seiko made a thinner version, or sure, if they got rid of the retrograde complication and just made it regular numerals all around and a three-hander, but super thin and super elegant, this would be a fantastic, amazing watch. It could be like a baby Creedor H in a sense, right? This is an awesome piece. I do think if you're dress watch leaning like me and this watch interests you, go for it, because I've enjoyed it immensely. I think you would too. And it's awesome because I think a lot of the times with white dials, companies use white dials and it tends to be a sports watch and it tends to have lume on it. So you have a lume signature that's not quite as white as the dial, and the white of the dial combats it and to me just looks ugly or looks weird. Whereas with this, you don't have any of that because you don't have any lume. You just have a pure, perfect white dial and beautiful contrasting black printing. And it just looks great and looks awesome. So yeah, consider this watch. I think it's great. Maybe you will too. Thank you as always for watching the video. Hope you got something out of it, and I'll see you in another one.